St. Louis 1 week after protests erupted in St. Louis over the acquittal of former police officer Jason Stockley, Mayor Lyda Krewson challenged the city to recommit itself to reforms laid out in the Ferguson Commission report. The 198-page report, consisting of 189 calls to action, was the culmination of nearly 10 months of work for a commission established by former Gov. J. Nixon in 2015 as a response to the outcry over the shooting death of Michael Brown, a black teenager, by a white Ferguson police officer. Commissioners grouped the post-Ferguson calls for action into three categories: justice for all, involving urgent police and court reforms, youth at the center, exploring policies to promote better lives for children and opportunity to thrive, laying out changes to address economic inequalities. 3 years later, as St. Louis enters its 8th week of protests following Stockley's acquittal in the 2011 shooting of Anthony Lamar Smith, regional leaders have largely focused on the justice for all component of the report, overhauling municipal court practices such as jailing defendants who could not pay their fines. In St. Louis, debates have begun on strengthening the Civilian Oversight Board, equipping police with body cameras, and developing police policies for using force and for handling public demonstrations. The report also called for improving the public's relationship with law enforcement through community policing, by encouraging police departments to facilitate better interactions between officers and those they serve, and allowing the public to weigh in on programs and policies through forums. Krewson points to a new requirement for police officers to spend time out of every shift outside their patrol cars, talking to residents. A citizens' commission is vetting candidates for a new police chief, but protesters have alleged police have used heavy-handed tactics to break up recent demonstrations, including mass arrests. Among the hundreds jailed during those protests was one of the men who led the Ferguson Commission, the Rev. Starsky Wilson, 5. Starsky Wilson, former co-chair of the Ferguson Commission, is arrested with other protesters who entered Interstate 64 Highway 40 and marched from the Compton Avenue overpass to the Jefferson Avenue exit on Tuesday, October 3, 2017. Sergeant Brian Rossmano told protesters, who asked to leave the area, that no order of dispersal was given and that they were being arrested for entering the interstate. Photo by Robert Cohen, R. Cohen at PostDispatch.com. Robert Cohen, R. Cohen at PostDispatch.com. In a recent interview with the Post-Dispatch, Wilson said that while police accountability and reform has clearly been the starting point for those revisiting the Commission's findings after the Stockley decision, he hoped elected leaders would forget the aspects of the report devoted to building a better St. Louis for the city's children. It can't just be about police. That's just one piece of the puzzle, Wilson said. Justice for all. Ferguson protests did produce changes, particularly in Ferguson itself, where new city and police leaders came into power. The state legislature also passed a municipal reform law limiting how much operating revenue cities could make from traffic tickets, after a Post-Dispatch investigation revealed that cities in the St. Louis region relied heavily on money generated through court fines and fees triggered by minor traffic violations and often targeting minorities. Ferguson's municipal court revenue plummeted from $2.7 million in 2014 to roughly $500,000 in 2016. In St. Louis, Wilson cites several achievements, including the creation of a Civilian Oversight Board and the decision to raise the city's minimum wage, both in 2015, though state lawmakers negated the wage effort this year. 5. Ward 1 Alderman Sharon T. Wyuse expresses her opposition to a proposed bill for a Civilian Oversight Board to investigate complaints against city police officers on Monday, April 20, 2015. The bill passed in a 178 vote. Photo by Christina Fletzbout. See Fletzbout at PostDispatch.com. Meanwhile, other bills have been introduced to address some of the Ferguson Commission's findings, including a measure being considered by the St. Louis Board of Aldermen limiting when St. Louis police could use pepper spray and tear gas. Sponsoring Alderman Megan Green, 15th Ward, says she hopes it will serve as a starting point for officials to discuss revising the city's vague ordinance against unlawful assembly. Asked what changes were made in the city police department in response to the Ferguson report, spokeswoman Scron Jackson said the St. Louis Police Department has begun training officers in de-escalation tactics and how implicit bias may affect the work, as well as how to work with victims of violence who are gay, transgender and bisexual. These kinds of higher training standards were among recommendations laid out by the Ferguson Commission. Additionally, Jackson said, the department has launched its Community Engagement and Organizational Development Division, which carries out community outreach programs. But Wilson questions these early efforts. When we see police arrest more than 300 people over 18 days, then we have to ask how seriously the increased training requirements were implemented, and how much culture change is actually happening around use of force, Wilson said. What were the lessons that were learned surrounding de-escalation? Allegations that police have improperly used force in recent weeks have already prompted the ACLU to challenge St. Louis police tactics in federal court. They've also sparked conversations at the St. Louis Board of Aldermen about when force should be used, and who should investigate afterward. The Aldermanic Public Safety Committee has already interviewed Marge Mary Warnicker, Deputy Commander of the department's Bureau of Professional Standards, and Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner. Gardner has pitched the formation of a new unit in her office to investigate use-of-force incidents and officer-involved shootings, arguing that it's no longer acceptable for police to be investigating themselves. In the long term, the Ferguson Commission recommended shifting deadly force investigations to the Missouri Highway Patrol and the State Attorney General. Last month, Gov. Eric Greitens said he was open to considering that proposal. City lawmakers, however, are exploring Gardner's idea, crafting legislation expanding the circuit attorney's prosecutorial powers and giving the office the ability to open investigations into police officers' use of force, according to Board of Aldermen President Lewis Reed. Police oversight. Reed says events such as the Stockley verdict can be catalysts for change, if legislators work quickly enough. The creation of the Civilian Oversight Board is proof of that, he said. Aldermen had attempted to institute an oversight board back in 2006, but the bill, which included subpoena power, was vetoed by former Mayor Francis Slay. Ferguson finally opened the door for its creation, Reed said, but subpoena power didn't have the support needed to make it into the final product. With the continued unrest, a new mayor, and a more open-minded board, Reed sees a window of opportunity to revisit subpoena power. I see a readiness for people now to step outside of what I would call their normal comfort zone and support efforts that probably in a normal state they would be a little more hesitant to support, Reed said. Ferguson supports giving subpoena power to the city's Civilian Oversight Board, which investigates complaints against police, and has said she agrees with community leaders who have demanded local police change how they handle use-of-force investigations and prosecutions. She also has committed to establishing a racial equity fund, a proposed 25-year city fund dedicated to promoting racial equity in the region. I know I don't have the decision-making power across all of these things, but I'm committed to adding my political will to the push to find the right way to get those things done, Ferguson said after the first week of protests over Stockley. Ferguson's aide said her scheduled didn't permit time to be interviewed for this story. Advocates acknowledge reform will take time, but some fear Ferguson's words won't translate to substantive changes. One thing they say she has the power to do immediately is oust interim police chief Lawrence O'Toole, who declared police owned the night after law enforcement used a technique called kettling to surround and arrest more than 100 people on a single evening. She has shown no indication that she will act before the chief hiring process plays out. 5 St. Louis Mayor Lyda Cruz listens as interim police chief Lawrence O'Toole addresses the media at the St. Louis Police Department headquarters on Saturday, September 16, 2017 about Friday's protests after the Jason Stockley not guilty verdict. Photo by David E. Carson. D. Carson at postdispatch.com. David Carson. We have all the answers we need in the report. The roadmap exists. The longer Ferguson chooses not to act, the longer our city hurts, said Charlie Cooksey, a catalyst with the Forward Through Ferguson advocacy group. Not a short-term endeavor. There may be a long road ahead in making changes laid out in the report a reality, but leaders have pointed to some encouraging signs. Wilson says he has noticed a more diverse group of people engaging in disruption this time, suggesting that people understand the problems don't amount to black people's issues alone, these are justice issues. Racial inequity harms the entire region and all people, he said. Forward Through Ferguson, the advocacy group that grew out of the Ferguson Commission, plans to knock on as many as 4,000 doors to get feedback before kicking off a series of policy campaigns next spring. It's not a short-term endeavor, Cooksey said. Diverse stakeholders in the region have to be committed to this for years to come, but those inspired to run for office after the events of Ferguson, such as Rasheen Aldridge, a former Ferguson commissioner and now Fifth Ward Democratic committeeman, contend that new leaders have emerged at the state and local levels who have a better understanding of why young people have been protesting in recent weeks. We have new people at the table, folks who are for the people, who haven't been bought out and who haven't been around for a while, Aldridge said. They're willing to do the work. Fifth Ward Democratic committeeman Rasheen Aldridge was among the 36 protesters who set up an open phone bank in front of the St. Louis police headquarters to make phone calls to residents against Prop P on Thursday, November 2, 2017. Photo by Laurie Scriven, L. Scrivan at postdispatch.com. Laurie Scriven.